Thank you, Rabbi Eisenberg. Thank you to Mizrachi. Thank you, Dr. Lazar. Thank you for all of you for coming. It's a Sunday. I know taking a couple hours out of your Sunday is not a given, especially with Pesach so close. I'm sure some people are here to kind of get away from the Pesach cleaning a little bit, so I understand that as well, but it's a good place to be and it's a good topic to be talking about. I wish we could be talking under happier circumstances. It'd be nice to come here and be talking to you about a recent trip I did with the Prime Minister, or talking about a new agreement with another Arab country, maybe Saudi Arabia. But if we are going to be talking about the topic of October 7th, what led up to it, the event itself and the aftermath, I think it's a good time to be doing it now. We just marked 6 months. That's 6 months since Israel changed, since many of us changed. I certainly changed as well. A reminder that many of the things that we thought were behind us as a people are still things that we have to deal with. It was a reminder that there are tens of thousands of people right on our borders that are spending all of their time, resources, energy, and talents trying to figure out new ways to get at us and kill us. That there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of young people, very well-to-do young people from very comfortable places in the world that are willing to spend their time marching to make sure that it's as hard as possible for us to have the legitimacy to defend ourselves. And of course, it's 6 months that 134 now hostages are held in conditions that we can only imagine, even though we don't want to imagine. So I think it's obviously an important topic to talk about. Now, I know that this community has been involved from the minute you heard about the attacks, whether it's just following the news. I'm sure some of you know people that have fought in the war, or maybe that were casualties of the attacks, wearing dog tags, sending money, sending equipment, praying, following. So first of all, thank you for that. It's noticed in Israel and it's appreciated. But it also means that when we come to talk about it, I think we can go a little bit deeper and do more analysis. So I won't do anything basic here. What I think will be valuable for you and will be interesting for me is to give you some insights into what the military lead up and some of the mistakes that were made that made October 7th possible or more likely. Why the fighting on the ground in Gaza looks like it does. Give you some insights there that you won't get, and some of the things that I can't write about because it's either off record or I haven't been able to verify it, with multiple sources, but I'm happy to just give you my sense. I will talk also about some of the diplomatic insights, where we stand diplomatically. And also, as the rabbi said, I fought in the war for 2 months as an officer in Division 98. If you want to ask me about that, we can. For me, it's less interesting because, I was just there. But we can talk about that as well. And hopefully by the end, you'll have a better context of why things have happened. You'll have some of my critiques. I think we have to be very critical of some of the decisions made, but that's fine. We can do that amongst family. And then I'll leave time for your questions. And obviously, we're probably going to want to talk about Iran and where that goes from there, which is the latest drastic development. So let's go back a little bit. And let's talk a little bit about the lead up to October 7th. We'll start with Hamas as an organization. History of Hamas, kind of very quickly, some of the highlights. 1987, it was an offshoot of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. It started out really as kind of a dawah, a charity and religious, what we would call kiruv organization. Trying to add more of a religious element to the struggle against Israel. Now, it started in the Gaza Strip, and just in general, when you look at Palestinian politics and development, things tend to start in the Gaza Strip. So the first Intifada, when Hamas came about, was started from the Gaza Strip. When Arafat came back into the Palestinian territories, it was Gaza. October 7th, Gaza. Hamas rules the Gaza Strip. That's where really things, in terms of the fight against Israel, start. The first attack that Hamas carried out was, somewhat appropriately, a kidnapping. Kidnapped 2 soldiers in 1989, drove from Beit Lahia in Gaza. There was no border or anything like that, no fence. picked up one near Ashkelon, one closer to the center of the country, murdered them, and drove back into Beit Lahia. That kind of set the tone for the future of the organization. But the vast majority of the victims of Hamas in the early years were not Jews, were not Israelis, but they were Palestinians. The focus was on targeting Palestinians who were not living the right kind of religious lifestyle, or especially Palestinians who were seen as collaborators with Israel. Now, don't think that there was any sort of evidence or trial or anything like that. It was people who were suspected, whether it's doing business, whether it's settling scores. Brutal story. And one of the leaders of this effort to find the collaborators was someone named Yahya Sinwar, who we know now as the mastermind of October 7th and the leader of Hamas in Gaza. Sinwar, brutal character. We know he's a monster, but it was known before that. There are Palestinian families in Hebron who tell the IDF, when you catch him, please drop him off in Hebron. We have a long score to settle with him. Don't worry, we'll do things to him that you would never do. So there is certainly a long memory of who this person is. He spent 20 years in Israeli prison, learned fluent Hebrew. His Hebrew is probably almost as good as mine. You can see interviews with him in Hebrew. And he was released in 2011. 2011 was the big Gilad Shalit deal, right? Gilad Shalit kidnapped by the Rafah Brigade. We'll talk about them, the Rafah Brigade of Hamas. Spent 5 years in Hamas captivity, and 1,026 prisoners amongst the many hardened terrorists were released. One of them, Yahya Sinwar, the lesson he learns from this is that if you kidnap Israelis, they will pay a big price and they will free not hostages, God forbid. They will free prisoners. They will free hardened terrorists. That is the lesson that he learns. And he also comes out of that experience with a sense of obligation toward the people that he sat in cells with, that I will get you out. Now, let's talk a little bit about kind of Israel's approach to the Gaza Strip over the years. Israel comes into control of the Gaza Strip twice. 1956, about 8 months of control during the Operation Mivtza Kadesh, give it back to Egypt, and then in 67, Israel takes it along with Sinai, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. By the year 2000, when we pull out of Lebanon, the Israeli idea and the concept is that there's no point in hanging on to territory that has a hostile population in it. It's much preferable and much more advantageous to pull out of these places, to get behind walls. We'll talk a little bit about the development of that concept, but the idea is let's pull out, and in 2005, Israel pulls out of the Gaza Strip entirely, every last soldier and civilian. 2006, Hamas wins the Palestinian legislative elections, and in 2007, they launch a surprise attack on the PA forces in the Gaza Strip. Okay, now here's something that you won't read about anywhere because it hasn't been written. I was a soldier in 2007 in the Gaza Strip. The initial orders as Hamas started their attack was that the IDF would defend the PA forces against Hamas. And then the orders came down to pull the IDF out. It's an internal Palestinian fight. Let's not get involved. And obviously that was a major mistake because perhaps the IDF could have stopped the Hamas takeover of the Gaza Strip and everything that happened afterward. Just a sense of who this organization is. After we were pulled out, I was in charge of the Israeli force at the Erez crossing in the northern Gaza Strip. Hundreds of Fatah, PA-allied family members fled into the crossing to try to get into Israel away from Hamas. If they had gone back into Gaza, they said they would have been killed. And it took a couple of days for Israel to figure out, what are we going to do with this hundreds of Palestinians? How are we going to get them to the West Bank? So they were stuck in this crossing. At some point, Hamas sent in 2 gunmen to start just shooting all these civilians, throwing grenades. And it was my forces that chased them off and had to treat the, again, Palestinian Gazans who were the victims of this Hamas attack, just to give you a sense of who Hamas is willing to target. Now, when we kind of fast forward to October 7th, and we ask, okay, what was Sinwar thinking? What was he trying to do? So one of the things that he took power in 2017 of the Gaza Strip, became the Hamas leader there. One of the things, obviously, as I said, was the prisoner thing. He felt like he needed to get those prisoners out of Israeli jails, and the way to do that was to kidnap. There's another bizarre kind of piece of evidence that has come to light in recent weeks. You can read about it at Memory if anyone reads that site. They have the protocol. There was a meeting in September 2021 that Sinwar led, which was about the liberation of Palestine. Now, that might be, okay, this is what they always talk about. It's a fantasy of theirs, very nice. This meeting was different. At this meeting, they started dividing up the liberated Israeli cities to different Hamas governors who would run them, right? So someone got responsibility for liberated Tel Aviv, someone for Haifa. There was even a Fatah, a very respected Fatah official who lived in Gaza. The Hamas people respected him. He has since fled to Egypt, paid his way out of the Gaza Strip after October 7th. But they called him and said, do you want to be the governor of Rehovot? That's where his family originally was from. We'll let you run Rehovot after we liberate it from the Jews. He told them, you guys are crazy. Don't talk to me anymore. Like, I don't want to hear any of your crazy ideas. But it shows you how kind of messianic and out of touch with reality in many ways Hamas under Sinwar's leadership was. Just if you're wondering what would have happened to the Jews under this crazy plan, it's very similar to the Nazis in the 1930s. People like me who are kind of useless to the good of society would have been killed immediately. People more useful like doctors, engineers, they would have let them live and serve the new Hamas Palestinian state. Again, very reminiscent of what the Nazis thought. So I think this really indicates what Sinwar was thinking and what he thought he could accomplish, at least in stages, but starting with October 7th. Let's talk about our side. We talked about the enemy. Let's talk about what Israel thought and what Israel was preparing for. If you think back about the IDF and the big victories that Israel has had, 56, 67, 73, that was from a certain classic security concept, that it's a small country, you have to call up the reserves, we have a lot of strategic infrastructure right near our borders. The way we win wars is we're never going to conquer Arab countries and change their politics, but what we can do is defeat them militarily very quickly. We get advance warning of their attacks, we either preemptively strike or we very quickly call up the reserves, bring the fighting to enemy territory, win the fight, and then they understand that they're not going to defeat us militarily, and they are willing to trade land for peace. That's what happened in 67, even in 73. But Israel started moving away from that classic concept. 1973, the Yom Kippur War was very bloody, over 2,200 casualties. There was a crisis between the soldiers and the leadership. How did you let us become attacked and surprised, very similar to October 7th? And people were less willing to accept that they could be casualties in war. And Israel started looking around for a different type of warfare. Luckily for Israel, at the same time, America was looking for the same thing. America had come back from Vietnam, didn't want to think about fighting guerrillas anymore, started looking at the Soviets again and understood, oh, we have a problem. The Soviets will always have an advantage in terms of the tank divisions that they'll have in Europe. If we try to meet them, NATO tanks against Soviet tanks, we're always going to have a disadvantage. Let's start looking to our advantages, which is technology. They started developing precision strikes, intelligence, airstrikes to take out the tanks. And that type of approach, called Revolution in Military Affairs, you might hear it as RMA, was very appropriate for Israel. The same type of advantage. It was seen as potentially a bloodless type of victory. Wars in the 1990s, whether it's Kosovo, it's the first Gulf War, only strengthened this perception that this is the type of warfare to go to. So this is what Israel started investing in its operations in the 1990s. There was no ground maneuver. The ground forces stopped maneuvering. It was all from the air. And this is indeed what you can see in Israel's operations in 2006 in the southern Lebanon, in the second Lebanon War. The only use of ground forces was as a last resort. The air has failed, so let's finally put in ground forces at the end. And then we fought this whole series of operations against Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Now, these operations were not meant to defeat Hamas in any way. Defeating Hamas in the Gaza Strip was seen as way too costly, bloody, and why would we want to reassume responsibility for 2 million Palestinians that don't like us? Again, the trend in Israel was let's get away from territories where there's a hostile population. Let us build defenses, walls, the Iron Dome, and let's hunker down behind them. Whatever happens on the other side of the wall, they can do what they want, but we'll be safe behind our walls. We fought Operation 2008-2009, that was CAS-led, 2012, 2014, Protective Edge. Every time we're telling ourselves the other side is deterred. Are they deterred? We fight another operation in 2018, 2019, 2021, 2022, 2023. It doesn't seem like the other side is very deterred. They're willing to continue to challenge us, and they feel like their approach is working. They double down on what they're doing. They double down on tunnels. They double down on rockets. It's not like the Arab armies that we fought in the classic days of our victories, where after every war, another Arab country would understand it can't defeat Israel and would either stop fighting or sue for peace. They doubled down on what they were doing. Now, the last time there was an Israeli plan to take over the Gaza Strip was in the year 2014. That was Operation Protective Edge. The commander of the Southern Command, Sami Turjaman, he had a plan called Sela Eitam. It was a very aggressive plan to take the Gaza Strip. It would be Gaza City and Rafah at the same time. We'll talk about that in a minute because it's relevant. And the rest of the Gaza Strip, it would be cut into 4 different parts. Within 2 weeks, the IDF has taken the Gaza Strip. The civilians stay in each sector and move toward the beach. And then the clearing of the terrorists within the cities begins. A very aggressive plan, very different than the way we fought. But that plan was canceled in 2015. From 2015 to 2024, there was no approved plan within the IDF for conquering the Gaza Strip. Now, when I heard about this, I was very surprised. I assumed the IDF had plans to conquer, I don't know, Saskatchewan, just, in a drawer somewhere, and any conceivable thing. It was certainly conceivable that the IDF would have to go back into the Gaza Strip, I thought. There was not a plan. Now, you might say, Lazar, what's it matter? So what? There wasn't a plan, right? You can make another plan. If there's not a plan, it affects the way the IDF builds itself. IDF is a poor army, gets a ton of money, but it still doesn't have enough money. Every shekel that goes toward intelligence in the Gaza Strip means it's not going toward intelligence, let's say, against Hezbollah, which was a much more pressing threat. So if we think that we're not going to go into the Gaza Strip, and from 2014, again, there was no plan to do so, we're not going to invest our intelligence in what goes on inside the Gaza Strip in terms of militarily. We care about the rockets they can shoot at us. Okay, there's intelligence about which units are firing rockets, where the rocket warehouses are. There is plenty of intelligence on that. If there is a tunnel going under the border into Israel, there's intelligence on that, and we would attack those once in a while. But if there's a tunnel going from the center of Khan Yunis to the north of Khan Yunis, why do we care? We're never going to go there anyway. They can dig all they want. Let them dig, right? Not our issue. It also affects the way that the IDF is structuring itself. If we never think we're going to have to go and deal with multiple tunnels at the same time in combat, then we don't have to build techniques and technology, and certainly not in massive numbers, to do so. If we have a couple of units that can do it, and they can be these boutique units, and if we find a single tunnel coming from Gaza toward Israel, we can take that unit and they can do it, they can do it and take their time. But we didn't create enough of these units to do it in a war. It affected the way we built ourselves. Other things were an offshoot of what we expected from the Gaza Strip that affected what happened on October 7th. Some things that seemed very small, but were very decisive on the day. The vast majority of the fighting on October 7th, at least in the morning, was done by the Kitot Konanut. These are the small squads of people that live on the kibbutzim, that are 12 to 15 people, that their job is to jump to any sort of, if there's any attack, say there's 3-4 terrorists coming in, these people jump, they deal with it until the army comes. The army will definitely be there within a half hour. Don't worry about it. The army started telling these Kitot Konanut to reduce their numbers. You don't need that many people. Go from 20 to 12. Why not? They started limiting what kind of weapons they could use. They started saying that the people in the Kitot Konanut, in these teams, couldn't keep the weapons in their house because they could get stolen. Now, at the time, the vast majority of thefts of weapons came from army bases, not from these people. So that means the weapons had to be kept in a centralized location in the center of kibbutz. And believe me, Hamas knew where these places were. Other mistakes that were made. All the forces around the Gaza Strip are commanded by the Gaza division at Re'im. Re'im is about 2 kilometers from the Gaza Strip. If it's 2 kilometers from the Gaza Strip, it means it is vulnerable to attack, right? And it doesn't help if it was 10 kilometers from the Gaza Strip, it could still do its job just as well of commanding the forces in the area. The fact that it was 2 kilometers from the Gaza Strip meant that it was close to attack, but it didn't give it any advantages. And not only was the division headquarters there, right next to the division headquarters was the brigade headquarters for the northern Gaza Strip, and the brigade command for the southern Gaza Strip. So basically all of the command of the forces in the Gaza Strip that needed to be doing the command of the forces as the attack happened were right next to each other, very close to the border. And as we know, they came under attack in the beginning of the day. Let's talk now. You've all seen what happened on October 7th. I don't need to go into the gory details, but I do want to point out one instance which is kind of the extreme case of the dysfunction, kind of the worst case of the military response to what happened. And that is kibbutz Nir Oz. Nir Oz is a small kibbutz, 1.8 kilometers from the Gaza Strip, about 400 people. And I'll give you just a sense of the timeline of what happened there, and then you kind of get a sense of how, again, this is the worst case. Other cases were done better, but it gives you a sense of the collapse of that day. So 6:29 a.m. is when the missiles start to be fired from the Gaza Strip. We had assumed, by the way, the whole time that the Hamas's main effort was the missiles and the rockets. It turned out the whole point of the rockets was for Israel to put its heads down, go into bunkers for their main effort, which was the ground attack. At 6:43 a.m., so that's 15 minutes later, there's already the fighting at Re'im at that division headquarters. That means the division basically stops functioning as the body that's supposed to start managing the battle on the ground. At 7:15 a.m., you start to get reports in the kibbutz WhatsApp groups. Why is there Arabic outside my house? I saw people on motorcycles inside the kibbutz. The people in the kibbutz know what's happening pretty early on. But again, since the main headquarters are fighting for their lives at the time, they're not able to get a sense of what's going on. 8:24, so about 2 hours into the attack, the first drone strikes, Israeli drone strikes happen within Israel, and they strike Nachal Oz. Now, Nachal Oz is two things. It's a kibbutz, and it's also a military base. The first drone strikes are to protect the military base. Now, it could make some sense, right? That if the military is able to function, then they'll be able to more quickly take control of the situation. But when you talk to civilians, let's say Nachal Oz, which was also under attack, the fact that the Air Force is going to protect the army before the civilians adds to the sense from that day that a lot of civilians feel like they were abandoned. 8:43, that's when you get the first reports from the Erez crossing in the north that soldiers have been kidnapped. And the first time something flies over Nir Oz was 9:04. Okay, so there's helicopters that fly over Nir Oz. 9:04 is 2.5 hours into the attack. They certainly see smoke coming up. They certainly see the fire, but there is no report from them on any radio that there is any attack on Nir Oz. It seems to be, it's just not getting through to the higher command. The first time an army radio says anything about Nir Oz is 10:15 a.m. So it's basically 4 hours into the attack is the first time anywhere on the military radio network mentions this kibbutz, which is full of terrorists at this point, and they're deep into doing what they're doing. By 10:30 a.m., the division has kind of retaken control of the base and is starting to divide troops and more orderly send troops around. And by 12:30 p.m., you have masses of IDF troops coming down to the Gaza border area and starting to go into the kibbutzim and starting to take control of the situation. However, by 1 p.m., so we're talking 6.5 hours after the attack starts, the terrorists leave Nir Oz, and they have not seen any IDF soldiers, and they go back to the Gaza Strip. Okay? The first IDF soldiers come to Nir Oz at 2:15 p.m., and then Egoz and Shayetet, two special forces, come, and there's no terrorists there for them to deal with. All that they can do is start literally laying out bodies and start helping civilians evacuate. From my research, I cannot find any IDF weapon that fired a single bullet all October 7th in Nir Oz, this is why I say this is the extreme case of the worst case, that you have civilians under attack for 7.5 hours. 1/4 of the kibbutz is either killed or taken hostage, and the IDF can't figure out how to fire a single shot. That is the worst it gets, and that's why I bring it up. There are other cases where the Kitat Konanut is able to actually stop the terrorists from getting in, from Alumim and Sad and kibbutzim like that. But I just want you to understand the extreme case to understand how bad it got. Let's talk about the Air Force briefly, because I brought them up as well. The Air Force, for many decades, has been the branch of the IDF that has gotten the most investment. As I said, Israel moved toward a new type of fighting, which really focused on intelligence and airstrikes. And on the day of October 7th, the Air Force did exactly what it was told to do. Okay, so there was 2 helicopters in Southern Command. Their job, they were on what's called Konanut Chag, so standby during a holiday. And their job was within a half hour to be over any incident in the Gaza Strip. What was the worst incident? Maybe 150 terrorists try to come across, go into 1 or 2 kibbutzim. They got to be ready. They were there within 28 minutes. However, I don't know if anyone here is a pilot, but it's very difficult for the Air Force to get a sense of what's going on the ground. That's why they need people on the ground to give them targets. Since this was all being done in such a chaotic fashion under attack, there was no one on the ground to tell them. If the Air Force gets a target, hit this point, they'll hit the point. They'll give exactly the type of munitions that needed. But without that, they can't tell who the good guys, who the bad guys are. Once these helicopters found targets by themselves, fired their weapons, to rearm takes 2 hours. By then, they're really just not relevant. The jets, they went to the north, they went over the Red Sea, they did what they were supposed to do. But in general, in the Air Force, we had the infantry reservists just kind of pick up their weapons and go south or go to their units without anyone telling them to. That didn't really happen in the Air Force. The Air Force is a much more centralized bureaucratic organization. That's their culture. Also, it's the way it operates, because all the technology, it has to really operate in a very centralized fashion. They are having conferences now, and they're asking themselves, what do we need to do different to make sure the next time, we act like the infantry did, and we try to, we don't have to wait for orders, and we just, do what we can to contribute. Let's say an F-16 pilot, even if he doesn't have a target on the ground, believe me, if he flies 100 feet over you, you're going to go somewhere else. So they ask themselves now, why didn't we do that? Why don't we just fly over? If we thought they were terrorists, we weren't sure, we weren't going to shoot, fly over it. We could have definitely kept people or chased people back into Gaza. By the end of the day, the Air Force was operating for sure. They killed 900 terrorists that were trying to come into Israel in third waves. So by the end of the day, they were functional, and since then they've been very functional, but that's just something that they've been asking themselves. In terms of what I personally saw as a journalist, I got down to the Gaza area on Tuesday, so that was October 10th. Just a sense of what it looked like. Just driving along a road before I reach any military checkpoint or anything, you see the terrorist jeeps just smashed up along the side of the road, kind of those Toyotas that ISIS made famous. Just go in, and what you find gives you a sense of what they were planning. In one of them, I found a bag of keys, so keys from Israeli homes that they had collected, and it was a lot of keys. A gas tank in the back, in the bed of the pickup truck, kind of this thing that could be used as an as an improvised bomb. They had these, we call them kind of kits that a pilot uses if a pilot's flying a long mission, so they can go to the bathroom. There's kind of these kits. They had a bunch of these, showing that they planned to spend a lot of time in ambushes for days within Israel. Those drugs, to put into their veins, to give themselves, to take away all their fear and give themselves more adrenaline. The story is told in what we could find. You'd walk around the fields, you see just kind of shoes, blood splotches, where you can figure out where the battles happened, where these terrorists were killed, where they were trying to go. Their bodies had since been taken by the IDF, but you can certainly see where each one of them fell. And at night, I was walking around in a forest with my colleague, and he told me to stop at some point. I looked down, there's a terrorist body right there, and another one on fire. I'm not sure why he was on fire, but this was 3 days after. But this is still the scene 3 days later, just terrorist bodies all over the place. We went into kibbutz Be'eri. That was the kibbutz that suffered the most casualties, over 100. And the houses were open. You walk into the houses, and you see that in every child's bedroom, the beds were lifted up. They were like stuck on dressers and things. And at first I didn't understand what. I thought maybe it was the rescue forces. Then it hit me that when a child is afraid, they hide under their beds. And terrorists obviously were going around and lifting up under their beds. Tells you the story. I went to the kindergarten, and you could see on the tables within the kindergarten all these like pistachios and snacks and coffee and things. It's obviously not from the kids. It was the terrorists had time to take a break, to have a snack in the kindergarten, sitting in front of the cubbies of some of the children that they would kill or kidnap. You see that in the first few days. The story is still there in a very tangible fashion. How much time do I have? Yeah. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the fight. October 7th, obviously a terrible day, quite a failure. Let's talk about Israel bouncing back. As I said, there was no plan to take over the Gaza Strip. From October 7th to the end of October, the last days of October, you had about 3 weeks where there was no ground incursion. What was happening in those 3 weeks? They were drawing up the plan that should have existed. Now, I talked to you about the plan from 2014, which was Rafah and Gaza City at the same time. As we know, they chose to just go into Rafah at the beginning. I asked Bibi about this in a press conference. Why did you approve Rafah at the same time where you presented this? He was kind of taken aback by the question, kind of dodged as he knows how to do. And I saw this week that he had asked the chief of staff, why didn't they do Rafah at the beginning as well? I want to tell myself he got that question from me. I don't know, but it's certainly a question that needs to be asked. The first stage of the ground operation looked different from the later stages. So they started with Gaza City. It made sense because that's where the best Hamas units were based, and that's where the rocket fire into much of Israel was coming from. It was done in a very slow but aggressive fashion. Why was it done slowly? Because, as I said, there was almost no intelligence about what to expect. If I had given you 17 years and $500 million and told you to build defenses, you could not build better defenses than Gaza City. Okay? All the advantages that an advanced military has. We could see further than the enemy. We can fire further than the enemy. We can coordinate with different forces. That all gets kind of nullified when you're in these urban environments where it's block to block, street to street. Even when Israel takes down a building, that becomes a wonderful defensive position for a defender. The fight had to be done very slowly. In terms of knowledge on where Hamas had its ambushes, it was less clear. It was 4 entire divisions fighting into one city. One division is about 15 to 20,000 soldiers. When the IDF was at its height, the biggest ground force ever was in 1982. In Lebanon, there was 7 divisions. That was the biggest IDF ground thing in history. So 4 entire divisions in one city. Very large, very slow, very careful. It also took This was the first time that the division commanders had ever commanded a division in battle, right? The last time a reserve division maneuvered, again, was 1982. So there's a lot of firsts. It took a while for the confidence to be built back up. The second stage was the Khan Yunis fight. There was the ceasefire for 8 days in late November, got 105 hostages out, and then the second stage began. I was in Division 98. Division 98 and that fight in Khan Yunis looked very different than the Gaza City fight. There's only one division to take the city instead of 4. And Division 98 is a very different type of unit in terms of its DNA. It's commandos, it's paratroopers, got 0 tanks. Their fantasy is that they'll be dropped deep into Syria and do all this stuff behind enemy lines. That's how they see themselves. The plan initially was to do a different type of operation, very targeted, try to find Sinwar and the senior leaders, try to find the hostages, and then conquer the city. For a number of reasons, that didn't really happen. There wasn't enough engineering equipment. There wasn't everything that they needed. It was still a much more targeted type of operation than Gaza City, primarily because the DNA of the organization and because intelligence was starting to come off the battlefield. We were starting to understand where Hamas is, what they're doing. You interrogate terrorists, you capture computers, you capture documents, you start to be able to fight in a more targeted fashion. The Khan Yunis operation ended 2 weeks ago, entirely out. So from a height of the IDF having 28 brigades in the Gaza Strip, there are currently, does anyone know how many brigades are in the Gaza Strip today? One. It's one. Nachal Brigade, there's one brigade in the Gaza Strip. If we're talking about the war itself, I would say the war is over, and we've already moved on to a different phase of the fight. Anywhere that Israel pulls out of in the Gaza Strip, Hamas comes back to. And that's not a surprise, that's expected. The fight right now is a unit-on-unit fight. So the idea is that an IDF division or brigade will smash apart the Hamas unit fighting them. To smash it apart, to defeat it, usually means about 70% of their forces are combat ineffective, killed, captured, wounded, or have just run away to the south. And then you have 30% left that have to be dealt with later. We saw that at the Shifa hospital in Gaza City, and we're going to see that in Khan Yunis. How does Hamas operate there? They have observers. When they understand that the IDF has left, they start to move back in, but they're not dummies. They start moving back in civilian fashion. Maybe they'll have clubs. They'll start showing all of the residents that move back as well that, hey, we still run this. We are here. If Israel can spot them, it will target them. But they slowly start to reassert themselves. When Israel pulled out of Khan Yunis, Hamas came right back in. Just to kind of set the expectations, that means Israel will have to go back to these places in a more targeted fashion now that the actual unit has been smashed apart. The one part of the Gaza Strip that is left that hasn't been conquered is Rafah. Again, that same city that was not conquered in the initial phase of the operation. Why is it important? First of all, it is a nucleus. The brigade there is enough for Hamas to retake the Gaza Strip. Once Israel pulls out, it's going to be the most powerful force in the Gaza Strip. That's plenty. 8,000 fighters is plenty to reassert themselves there, to say that they won. And there's no question that that this unit has to be broken apart. And it's also the border, right? That is, the city sits on the border. That's where Hamas smuggled in its weapons. If you look at videos, pictures from October 7th, they have weapons that came from the outside. They have North Korean weapons, they have Iranian weapons, Russian weapons. Those came under and over that border. Now, the Biden administration would like Israel to do a very targeted kind of special forces-y operation, 10 guys with cool stuff on their helmets, kick in a window, grab a bad guy, and leave. It's not going to happen. The Biden administration thinks that's going to be somehow less destructive. Now, we have a test case. There was one very special forces-y operation in Rafah. It was the operation where the IDF succeeded in rescuing 2 hostages. Very small force. A very small force is not very good at protecting itself. When they came under fire from the city, when the city woke up, Israel had to employ a ton of firepower to help them get out. It means a smaller force, what the Biden administration wants, is going to be much more aggressive than a larger force that's able to take the city and then work in a more targeted fashion. So when it happens, I think it will not be done the way the Biden administration wants, but they don't necessarily understand the reality of the fighting on the ground. Was that? I didn't say it explicitly. When will it happen? So there's still the civilians in Rafiah, about 1.5 million. I do not doubt that Israel is going to wait for them to be evacuated. That hasn't started yet. The last time I spoke to the Prime Minister's office yesterday, they said there was not a date for it yet. No, it was 2 days. It was before the Iran thing. It was 2 days. It was before Shabbat. But I saw that the Defense Ministry published a tender for 40,000 tents. That means they are starting to buy the tents needed to give to the aid organizations to get the civilians to start moving. I don't think it'll be a surprise when it happens. We'll have plenty of indications. Hamas will know when it's going to happen. The idea is that they're going to start moving toward the north, right? If you see the central Gaza Strip is very, very agricultural, not very crowded. Toward the beach, there is room. There's absolutely room. You can look at pictures from it to move north. It's harder to move people a second time. In war, you can always move them the first time. They become much less willing to move, and of course, Hamas will do whatever it can to try to keep them from moving. I'll say a couple words about the diplomatic situation, then we can take questions. Let's talk about our Arab partners. Egypt and Jordan. They have been very critical throughout, especially Jordan. The Queen basically denied that October 7th even happened. There have been bitter protests in the kingdom. Jordanians don't like us, 60% Palestinian, definitely don't like us. But I want to make something very clear. First of all, Jordan and Egypt and Saudi Arabia for sure definitely want Israel to win. They do not want an Iranian proxy stuck in the middle of their throats. They want Iran and all of its weapons as far away as possible. The military to military relationship between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Jordan has never been better. And I'm not only saying that because of what happened with the Iranian attack. There's evidence of this. Those protests that are going on in Jordan, where do they happen? They happen in Amman. How far is it from Amman to the Israeli border? 20 kilometers. Believe me, these protesters want to get to the Israeli border and make trouble. Not a single one has been able to get there because the regime says you can walk around Amman all you want. You're not getting toward Israel's border. Jordan has been carrying out airdrops every day during Ramadan, airdrops over the Gaza Strip. They can't just do that on their own. Okay, if they're going to fly into a war zone where Israeli helicopters, drones, F-16s, F-35s are all operating, plus artillery, that means Israel has to close off the entire airspace. There's nothing flying from Israel anywhere where there's that plane going. That means there needs to be very tight coordination for Jordanian airdrop to happen. As the Jordanian pilots are flying, they need a way to be in touch with all the Israeli forces, or at least the commanders of the Israeli forces around them. That means every day they are talking to each other. They are coordinating these airdrops. The trust is even so good that there are shipments of humanitarian aid that come from Jordan. If the Jordanian chief of staff says to Israel, "Don't worry, I checked it," that's enough for Israel. There are Jordanian shipments that are not checked by Israel because the personal trust there is so good. And you saw that Jordan took part in the defense of Israel. They sold it as a defense of Jordan, but come on, a defense of Israel against Iran. Iran has really been putting a ton of pressure over the last months on Jordan, trying to get Shiite militias, they're massed on Jordan's northern border. Jordan knows that if there's any danger to the regime, the only country that is going to come and save it is Israel. Israel did it once in the 1970s, and they know that they would do it again. Let's talk about Egypt. Egypt, their big enemy is the Muslim Brotherhood, right? The Muslim Brotherhood took power for a year, 2012, 2013. Sisi, the current president, led the counter-revolution, threw all the Muslim Brotherhood leaders and hundreds of their people into prison. They certainly don't want Hamas to win or exist or anything like that. They're afraid of Hamas, as they did in the past, detonating the border and hundreds of thousands of Palestinians coming into the Sinai. They can't even feed their own population. They certainly don't want to feed tens of thousands of Palestinians. Just a sense of how close the coordination is between Israel and Egypt. Every time Israel attacks in Rafah along the border, they tell Egypt ahead of time. Why? In 2014, there was an Israeli strike on Rafah. The bomb hit inside of Gaza and then skidded across the border, landed in an Egyptian base. Thank God it did not detonate. You can think how bad it would be if Israel had killed Egyptian soldiers and then the Egyptian government, which is already accused of being a collaborator, would be forced to respond. Egypt had Israel come and defuse the bomb. But to make sure that doesn't happen again, anytime Israel strikes in Rafah, it tells Egypt, all the Egyptian soldiers go into bunkers. Israel strikes, they say we're done, and they come back out. This is real tight coordination and cooperation between the sides. Just a final point, I guess we'll talk about the north, and we can ask questions as well. Hezbollah, I think, was taken by surprise by the timing of the attack, but felt like they had to respond. Couldn't respond in a way that dragged the country into war. The Lebanese people have no appetite for war. They barely have electricity. They understand that Hezbollah has not done much to build the country. They understand they're limited into their ability to strike Israel, but they have to strike Israel. The only successful attack they could have had would be an October 7th style attack. But once Hamas started attacking, Israel understood this is a possibility, sent the majority of the forces to the north. They're not going to be able to surprise us in that way again. The current fight is to Israel's advantage, right? It's an intelligence and strikes fight. This is the force that we've been building for decades. We are absolutely taking them apart. They've killed 12 soldiers. We've killed over 250 of theirs, senior leaders. Their special forces are no longer on the border because there's no reason to be if they're not going to be able to get in. But Hezbollah can't figure out how to end this fight because they will be seen as having lost. So they don't know how to end it. They say the only way we will is if the fighting in Gaza ceases. If there was a ceasefire, they probably would be able to stop. But at the same time, Israel is also in a problem, not because this fight is bad for us, because we're doing very well, but because we, for the first time, evacuated all of the north. We didn't do that in the 80s when the PLO was shooting. We didn't do it in 2006. Very hastily, it was done, and we don't have a way to get them back. It's either going to be a diplomatic agreement with Hezbollah, which is less than likely, or a military operation that takes care of the problem. Military operation was something that was pushed by much of the war leadership in the early days. Thank God Netanyahu didn't approve it. It's just not something that should be done now. If we'd be fighting on both borders, it would mean we would basically not be able to finish the job in the south, and we would be fighting a very dangerous fight in the north. It's inevitable, but hopefully a few years down the road, when the reserves had time to get back to work, to rest, we've had time to resupply, restock our weapons, to learn the lessons we need from Gaza and to change the force, and then we can pick the time of the fight, but hopefully it won't happen now. I'll just finish with a very positive note. If we had to fight that October 6th fight, the fight in the north on October 6th, we would have been much, much less capable than we are now. We would have been much better than Hezbollah, but we are incomparably more capable now. Your average Israeli soldier has 18, 19-year-olds has 6 months of combat experience. Even the chief of staff doesn't have that. There's almost no one besides this generation that has that experience of 6 months of fighting. Previous Israeli wars did not last that long. You have commanders who have now commanded their units in battle for 6 months. You go down to company, battalion commanders, they have been calling in airstrikes, drone strikes. They've been using drones and engineers and been working with other units for 6 months, developing new techniques. This is a very different, a very capable force than on October the 6th. The reserves are basically eulogized already. It was seen, why do we want to keep paying for these guys that train once a year, that have all these problems back home? They got kids, their wife is telling them don't stay away too long. They have jobs to go to, probably not in the best shape. This is not the future of warfare. Let's start shutting most of them down. We'll keep a couple open for the north, but let's shut the rest of them down. The way the reservists responded on October 7th and beyond, and the way that they have been in the fight for 3-4 months, saved the idea of the reserves. It's going to be something that's very healthy for the social fabric of the country moving forward. They really proved themselves that it's a necessary body. In my unit, where there was a shortage of combat drivers, people who could drive at night with night vision on the battlefield. These guys in their 50s, who had been in special forces and all sorts of cool stuff, came back, stayed away from the families. They were in the mud with us for months. So it is absolutely something that is very heartening. So if I'm going to leave or end my prepared talk on a good note, the IDF is as strong as it's ever been. It's as prepared as it's ever been. I think the results of what happened on Shabbat prove that. There's a lot to learn. October 7th will be a scar and a stain for years to come. But from that, a lot of strength has emerged in the country and in the military as well. But it's something that we're going to be dealing with for many years to come, and this is our generation's fight. With that, I will stop talking, and I think we can take some questions. What's that? I was going to wait for someone to ask me that question. If they don't, you have a question about Iran? I'll say a few words about Iran. Okay. The Iranians have been looking weak for a while. They had to be seen as taking part in this attack on Israel since October 7th. However, they have struggled to really do anything of note, right? Hamas was leading the fight, and Iran was struggling to keep up. In February, at the 4-year anniversary of the killing of Qasem Soleimani, who was the legendary leader of the IRGC, killed by the Trump administration, ISIS carried out a twin terrorist attack in the heart of the country, killed over 80 people. That certainly did not make the Iranian regime look very strong, and especially to its people. The people in Iran do not like the regime, and it's always worried about some sort of revolution, and it wants to look strong to its people. Iran decided to respond by attacking in Pakistan. There were some ISIS camps there, or ISIS aligned. Pakistan has a very good military, has nuclear weapons. It struck back inside of Iran, and Iran said, oh, it's enough. We're going to sue for peace. So Iran has not looked very strong of late. The fact that Israel has been killing top generals, killed one in December. On April 1st, it killed Mahdavi. It really felt like it needs to respond and show that it is not going to be pushed around, and this was its response. The response did not go well for Iran. Okay? The main thing that they wanted to hit was the Nevatim Air Force Base. It's very Iranian to kind of have rules of the game, tit for tat. The F-35s that killed the general came from the base. They wanted to hit the base. They didn't knock out the base at all. The base is still working. You can see pictures. There's some kind of holes in the sand. Very good. That was as good as far as they went. They injured one Israeli, 7-year-old girl, Muslim. A wonderful reminder to the region that it's not only Jews who are threatened by Iran, and they succeeded in taking Israel from the center of world opprobrium. The discourse in the West, in Europe, and in the U.S. was suffering Palestinians. We need a ceasefire. The ceasefire was no longer conditional on the release of hostages. That was what people were talking about. Netanyahu is screwing up the war. He doesn't let in humanitarian aid. Gazans are suffering. We need to end the war. And all of a sudden, it reminded everyone that there is this Iranian enemy that is behind what's going on in Gaza, that is behind what's going on in Ukraine, and that is a threat not only to Israel, but to the Arab countries as well. Israel could not have asked for a more helpful way to change the narrative. And they even succeeded in having the House of Representatives move up the debate, which would have been stuck on new aid package to Israel. So I think Israel comes out on top. This was basically the debut, the opening night of this regional air defense architecture. Saudis, UAE, Jordan, Israel, France, Britain, us. You know, it was kind of below this. Now it's out in the open. Everyone sees it. They see how well it works. What a wonderful thing. So this could not have gone worse for Iran and better for us. Another happy thing. So there you go. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Whether or not Hamas moved on that in advance practice or whether they happened upon it. Question number one. And question number two is, how does the relationship between the Hamas leadership in Qatar and Qatar also, how does that play into the have to do this?
Sure. The sense I get, and I think no one really knows, but in terms of the Nova Festival, it wasn't on. They captured a lot of maps and stuff from the terrorists themselves. There was definitely a lot of intelligence on exactly where to go to the IDF bases. They knew that very well, and where to go inside the kibbutzim. They haven't found anything that talked about the festival that I've seen. So the sense that people have is that they didn't know about the festival. They stumbled upon it. That's where that was the bloodiest incident. That was over 300 people were killed there. So that was the worst of it. In terms of the Hamas leadership, it's a good question. There's a question whether the political leadership even knew about it, what the military leadership was going to do, and how much influence they have. The belief is that Sinwar is still making the decisions on the hostage release. He's still calling the shots, and he seems to be more and more intransigent as time goes on, and it's kind of understandable. He understands he's survived the worst of the IDF attack. As I said, 28 brigades down to 1. He has seen the pressure coming from the US and Europe on Israel and understands the more time that goes on, from going to demanding a release of hostages and then a ceasefire. Now the demand was just a ceasefire. Why not wait, right? Why not? And he was probably waiting to see what Iran would do as well. So I think the international pressure on Israel has badly undermined any pressure on Sinwar to actually come to a deal. The last lever that there is this Rafah operation, which Israel said it will do. But the sense that I get is that he is calling the shots, and the political leadership is much less influential. There's also, you mentioned Qatar. There's the question of the role that they're playing and what their future is. The Saudis hate them. The UAE hates them. They were kicked out of the GCC in 2015, I believe. They were let back in recently. They certainly don't like them. They don't like what Al Jazeera does in the region. For some reason, the Biden administration really likes Qatar. They see them as a very effective mediator. They mediated the deal with the Taliban, that deal with Iran that freed people from Iran and gave them access to a lot of money. That was also a Qatari mediation, and they signed a deal with them that it was a major non-NATO ally. Israel does not see Qatar as an effective mediator. It's not a coincidence that the recent hostage talks are taking place in Cairo and not in Doha, because Israel wants them to be the mediator as well, because we feel that Qatar is not able to pressure the political leadership of Hamas effectively. Yes, in the back.
Related question. Seems to be open season on Netanyahu right now. Do you think he's the problem, or is he a problem? And so what's the solution? And secondly, there's an expectation that the end of the war, whatever that means, there's going to be a turnover in both political and military leadership. Where will he come?
Okay. Netanyahu. I think you're right in that a lot of the criticisms of Israel's war have been framed as criticisms of Netanyahu, even though some of these things are consensus. So it's not a Netanyahu idea that we need to go into Rafah, right? Across the board, Israelis are for this. They gave Netanyahu, they continue to say Netanyahu is in the way of a Palestinian state. You had President Herzog in Davos sit on the stage and say publicly, no Israeli in their right mind is talking about a Palestinian state right now. So these are not Bibi problems. Bibi is probably to the left of the Israeli public on humanitarian aid. If you took a poll of Israeli public and said, do you want there to be massive aid going to the Gaza Strip when the hostages are getting nothing? Most people say no. But Netanyahu, even though it's somewhat begrudgingly, is certainly willing to do that. So I think a lot of if people want to criticize Israel, but it's more comfortable to do that by focusing on Netanyahu. Is he part of the problem? I think certainly his leadership, like most politicians, like Biden as well, he's playing domestic politics. I think that is what has gotten him to be difficult about humanitarian aid and then be forced after a couple of weeks to relent instead of getting ahead of the ball and getting credit for it because he's afraid of his right wing. So they say, we're never going to open Kerem Shalom. They open Kerem Shalom. We're never going to open Erez Crossing. They open Erez Crossing or the Ashdod port, things like that. So I think he, at a time, he's fought very hard to be the prime minister. He said, I'm the only one that can defend Israel. He's in the position, defend Israel. Like, you have waited your whole life for this. And he continues to play politics. I think he could be a more effective war leader if he wasn't. Your second question? First of all, all the military leadership is not going to survive this. The probes, absolutely not. The head of intelligence is going to be gone. The whole chain of Southern Commander, they're all going to be gone. Chief of Staff, they know this already too. They're fighting to win the war, and then they'll be gone. Where they're going to come from? The next generation. There's no shortage of talented officers. It's not like these are the 10, 20 people the only 10, 20 people we have. Don't forget, a couple of years ago, it was a different group of people that was running the show. As well, so I'm not worried about that. Political leadership, I'd be very happy to see a new generation rise up and not the same people shifting seats. That's just my personal opinion. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
I read somewhere that some of the younger soldiers had warned one of the top commanders that there was various things going on.
Yep. I wasn't there, but I've seen multiple reports on that, and it hasn't really been denied. That seems to be absolutely true. Now, anytime there's an endless amount of information that is being picked up, right? It becomes intelligence once it's interpreted. So I'm not going to be so critical that not every single scenario was considered, but there seemed to be a breakdown in the willingness to consider alternative possibilities. It's called red teaming, where you have the main conclusion, but then you have someone whose job it is to attack it. It seemed not to be done. That's the same mistake that was made 50 years earlier, right? October 6th, 1973, that led to that catastrophe. So the warnings were certainly there, but if the head of the military intelligence, his job is to make those decisions, and he made the very much wrong decision, and he is not going to survive these cuts. That's for sure. Yeah. Yeah. So on the precision, that's what I was referencing earlier. There was this, I think, ill-considered. Humanitarian assistance is not what is going to let Hamas win the war. If Hamas is hungry or if they're well-fed, it doesn't really matter, right? They're going to keep fighting. Everything should have been done to maintain legitimacy, so support amongst our allies, and they should have known that the humanitarian issue was going to be a problem, so why not get ahead of it? Israel should have built that port that America is building. Israel should have been the one that was pushing ahead and with all these ideas instead of seemed to kind of dragged into it. Certainly could have been done from the beginning. I think that was a serious mistake. What did you ask the other one? Oh, the precision. The fighting will get more and more targeted. first of all, just so everyone know, when you talk about precision strikes and on like CNN, they're like, why are you using dumb bombs? Precision is not that precise. The definition of precision is that 50% of the munitions hit within a 300-meter area. It's not very precise at 50%, right? So if you think in an urban environment, even if you have precision, even if 100% of them hit within a 300-meter area, and you know that a terrorist is in a certain house, 300 meters, there's plenty of people in that area. That's still precision. So when newscasters talk about precision, they really don't know what they're talking about. There's certainly no law that demands that you have to use precision weapons, but even if you did, it could still be very bloody. But yeah, the fighting will be more targeted. Picture the West Bank when operations are based on specific intelligence. So unlike the Gaza City fight, when it was just to conquer and to break apart the unit, now they have enough intelligence coming up where they can be much more specific. Yes, sir. Yeah, not great. Obviously, at war, first of all, there's a lot of expenditures on the fighting. When you take out 280,000 of people who are very productive, your most productive people, they're the ones who are all taxpayers and are working. Not only are they not paying taxes and doing business, they're also, you have to support them, and tourism, investments, not great. But Israel has the ability to bounce back into weather economic downturns. So I don't think that is going to get in the way of the war, but naturally, during wars, these things are problematic. And kind of a lot of the projects that we had dreamed about with the UAE and Bahrain and stuff are all frozen. They're not going to move forward until we're well beyond this. Yeah.
What do you think Israel's response to that is going to be?
Good question. I think the appropriate response would be to strike the Iranian drone facilities. That would be another nice tit for tat. It would be seen as legitimate by the world. You attacked us with these drones, we're going to destroy your drones. It would be a favor to our Arab friends in the region. Those drones were the ones that attacked the Saudi oil facilities in 2019. They're also the things that are being shipped up to Russia to kill Ukrainians. So we're doing a favor for the Europeans as well. And we could do it in a way that is deniable. When we struck in 2007, the Deir ez-Zor nuclear facility in Syria, we never said it was us. Syria didn't have to respond because we didn't embarrass them enough, but everyone knew it was us. That would be the best response. The sense I get is that there has not been a decision. There was 2 meetings yesterday. There was a meeting with Bibi, Gallant, and Gantz. And afterwards, I spoke to someone and they said there was no decision then. And then there was a war cabinet meeting. I think a decision has not been made. It's a bitter fight. Most people, I think, in decision making feel like we have to strike back. But the Americans, their word is de-escalate, de-escalate, de-escalate. It doesn't have to be now either, right? It could be a little bit of time later, but I hope that there is some response that everyone understands that we don't just take this sitting down.
A couple of questions. Number one is the body counts in Gaza. They're always fully Hamas. And it seems like now the Americans and the whole world seem to think they're Gaza. That's the first question. The second question is, I saw something on TV today, it was on CNN, that the Iranians kicked off the Turkish, that they were doing an attack, the Turkish told the Americans. Now, I thought the Turkish are friends with, why did they kick off the Americans? I know they're part of NATO, but kind of unusual. And that's the third point, I know Frontline is no friend of the Israelis, or Israel, or PBS, but they did a thing on October 7th, kind of postmortem about it, talking about what they want. And I think they showed one of the Iranian soldiers saying that, officers know this and so that's important to get hold of that problem. Kind of, it's all.
Okay, so on the body count, first of all, there's no way that Hamas knows the numbers. There's no force that has been in a war in an urban environment that knows exactly how many dead they have. They haven't been able to get to all the areas. No one will know until years down the road when buildings are they start to go through the ruins. There's no way they know. Those are made up numbers. And there's also been statisticians, I don't understand this stuff, they say the numbers don't act like numbers would in war. Biden quoted it as fact during the State of the Union address. So this wasn't just Biden speaking off the cuff as he does. This was actually a prepared speech, which shouldn't be done. I think Israel could have pushed back harder. Is that likely a ballpark? It's certainly a reasonable number, right? We know Hamas doesn't consider any, doesn't say any of them are fighters. It's a reasonable number. It has no bearing on the legality of anything, though. I mean, there's no stipulation in anywhere in the laws of war that talk about, you reach a certain number, this becomes illegal or illegitimate. But you're right. You'll see at Times of Israel, we give the whole description that the Gaza-controlled health ministry, the Hamas-controlled health ministry in Gaza says this number. These are unverified. We give the whole thing. I wish other outlets would do it as well. And your second question was, Turks. If they told the Turks, that was to tell the Americans. Like that is the way they tell the Americans indirectly. There's no question. If they told them, yeah.
What do you think that Israel can realistically do to kind of shake off the heavy reliance on American military and
good question.
support, so that we're not constantly being hamstrung by this administration or the next administration?
Yeah, so there is a recognition that, there is a strategic problem that too much of our weaponry comes from the United States. You start to see signs that things are being moved to Israel, moving away from even some of the rifles that are made in the U.S. to domestic production. The Tavor is an Israeli designed rifle, but it was made in the U.S., so it would be cheaper for us. But now they're moving to some that looks like an M16, but is made in Israel. And there's a recognition that things need to be made in Israel. Might be more expensive, but you hit the nail on the head. And I think there is a recognition of that. Yes.
So you think that Iran is now the catalyst which will bring Saudi Arabia into relations with Israel?
It's a good question. About Iran, will Iran now be the one that pushes Saudi Arabia to normalize with Israel? Big picture, yes. Okay, I don't think this particular attack changed anything in terms of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia knows what Iran is. Saudi Arabia dislikes Iran more than Israel does. Believe me. Saudi Arabia has already been attacked by Iranian drones that shut down half of its oil production. Saudi Arabia has sent troops to fight a war against the Iranian proxies in Yemen. There is no question that this is the strategic context. They want American guarantees, and to get that, they're willing to normalize with Israel. I don't think it's going to happen soon. They already get whatever they want from Israel. If they want intelligence from Israel, any sort of military support, they get it. There's not really a reason for the Saudis, who already are criticized for being stooges of the West, to feed into that by making a public deal with Israel. Down the road, I think it's inevitable. You even had the Saudi ambassador to the UK say, I think it was December, that they're still interested in it, right? So this is at the height of the criticism of the Gaza thing. They're still talking about it. It's inevitable. The Saudis really don't like us. The Saudi people really don't like us. I think the polls were 96% said that all Arab countries should break ties with Israel. 40% said they support Hamas. The street in all these countries don't like us. But the regime is the one that does, and the regime is MBS, Mohammed bin Salman. And I think the reports are, I can't confirm this, he's been to Israel twice, 2015, 2018. So he gets it, but I don't think it makes sense for him to put his neck out there when he's already getting what he wants. Yes, sir.
This morning, John Bolton was on CNN, and he said one of the reasons that Hamas can't make a deal is there are only 27 hostages left that are alive. So that may be a problem.
How does John Bolton know that?
John Bolton said on very reliable source, whatever that means. One of the things that I've heard from a lot of the reservists is they're being told to get ready to come back in July or August. Now, the longer that it takes Israel to go into Rafah, the better for Israel, because it puts that much more pressure on the Biden administration. Are they going to be in bed with the Hamasniks, of Dearborn, Michigan? Or are they going to be in bed with Israel? And every one of the American allies right now, including Taiwan and including the Saudis, is watching exactly what a rock-solid relationship is with the United States.
Okay, so on the hostage thing, I don't know where John Bolton gets intelligence from these days.
Well, if they don't have 40,
That's what Hamas says, but Hamas is in the middle of a negotiation. What do we know? We know that there are 105 that were released in the last deal. There was 12 bodies that have been recovered by the IDF. Israel succeeded in rescuing 3, only 3 total, and that's not surprising. Hostage rescues don't really work usually, and Entebbe has kind of changed our expectations of it. And I think there were 4 released in the early days before there was a deal, so we have 134 left. 34 families have been told by Israel that their loved ones are not alive. If they're being told, that means there are multiple sources of intelligence that indicate that. They would never tell them if there was any doubt. Israeli officials privately think it could be up to twice that number. But to say 27, it could be that he was talking about 27 civilian ones, right? That's more likely because there's also a lot of soldiers, which are kind of a different negotiating issue. In terms of when reservists are called up, I wouldn't put too much into that. First of all, they need to have a general date of when to prepare for. Because I heard the same thing about April, that people are saying, oh, we're going to be called up in April, something's going to happen in April. They were called up in April, and some of them went to the north. And so we're already in round 2 of the, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it means that there's going to be an operation because you need many more troops on the borders now. So I wouldn't put too much on that. I think it becomes more difficult for Israel the closer we get to the elections. I really do. Once you imagine if we're in Rafah during the Democratic convention and then Genocide Joe all over the place, and it's not, and then the Americans will do whatever they can to shut down that operation. I don't think it helps us, but there's a tension. They're trying to be everything to everyone. They understand that their credibility as an ally, you know, after an attack like October 7th, you can't be seen as betraying an ally, but at the same time, they have their domestic politics to play. It's a very tough needle to thread. I don't think they're doing it that well. But I think the sooner is better. How much more time? One more question. You have it.
Some people feel that, believe that Hamas has been strengthened in Ramallah and surrounding areas. What is your opinion of the enemy within?
Yeah, certainly the support on the street for Hamas has risen. There's no question about it. But even beforehand, if the IDF was not in the West Bank, Hamas would be running the West Bank. The PA can't even control Jenin. They can't control the West Bank. They can't control the Gaza Strip. But on the ground, I don't think they've been strengthened because Israel has been very, very aggressive in the West Bank. They would love to carry out more terrorist attacks from the West Bank. They haven't been able to because the IDF is operating much more aggressively than it was before October 7th. Hundreds of arrests and assassinations. Now, they use airplanes in the West Bank, which they didn't do before. Let's say the Jenin refugee camp, which was a no-go zone for the PA and for Israel. Israel has operated it was a brigade operation on foot walking into the middle of that thing. So there's nowhere where the IDF won't go in the West Bank anymore. But that's not to say there aren't problems. The Jordan Valley has gotten much more problematic. There's many more shootings there as well. So Iran is doing whatever it can to make the West Bank hotter. But we're doing a good job of countering that.